For your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Here ends the gospel for the day. Please be seated. As I often do, as I spend the week thinking about the text for the coming Sunday, I somehow am involved in the conversation that I have with people, some that I know, some that I don't know so well, is I ask them questions that apply to the sermon for Sunday. And I did 3 questions this week, and actually I sprung them on the adult class this morning to get some feedback on All Saints Day. The first question I asked was if you could take all the people in history and pick out one person that you would like to spend the afternoon with and just talk to them about their time or their philosophy, their ideas, who would it be? Usually we think that would involve somebody who passed away. The second question I asked was, and it's a Time question from Time magazine. Each year they have a question that they address people: who is the most respected person in America today? Third question I asked is, would you like to be a saint? Or do you think you are a saint? And I would ask that question and ask you to raise your hand, but I won't do that because some of you have been raised in the Lutheran tradition would have a different response to that than other people. But it's a good question. Do you think you're a saint? In answer to the first question, it was amazing that really only, of all the people I asked, only one person asked or talked about a person that they would like to bring back from the dead to talk to. Only one of them mentioned somebody they would like to talk to because of that person's religious faith. It is interesting that of those that they respected most today, unless it was a parent, it was somebody who had no religious particular leaning or were not known for their religious faith. Now, if you asked that question 20 years ago, and Time did, for a number of years, the person that was most respected in America was a clergyman. It was Billy Graham. But now that's passed. Probably the most recognizable clergy name in America is Joel Osteen. But he very seldom makes any lists as far as whether he has exhibited any sainthood. And then, of course, when I asked the question, are you a saint? It was interesting, in the Sunday school class this morning, only one person raised their hand. And it's basically a Lutheran teaching that we are all saints, and we'll get to that in a minute. But people very seldom describe themselves as saints. Some would ask the question, well, what do you mean by a saint? And if by being a saint it means somebody that was kind of foregoing all earthly pleasures and giving up those things that made life kind of fun, they would say, no, I'm not a saint at all. Or if you look at their behavior patterns, probably not some that you would describe as saintly. So the question today is still, do you want to be a saint? All Saints' Day began in the church as early as the 2nd century. As early as the 2nd century. And it arose for people to celebrate those people who had been martyred for the faith. Usually a saint was considered somebody that had given the ultimate thing, their life, to retain their faith and would not deny it. And what happened then is the church began to place Sundays as celebration days for saints. Well, of course, that ran out somewhat quickly. And so then each day became a saint's day. And the Catholic Church held that tradition, and pretty soon the entire calendar, 365 days, were used up. And not only did they think that maybe sainthood should be placed on those that had passed away, and that was one of the prerequisites of being a saint, they thought that some people probably should be honored for being a saint while they were still alive. And so out of that conversation came this Sunday, All Saints' Day, where you could sit and celebrate those people that had gone before, that had proclaimed the faith, that had established their churches, to honor all those people who died being faithful in their faith. Not only is the Catholic Church involved in that, but many of the Protestant churches are too. Many of the churches that are Protestant do the ceremony that the Catholic Church has, where they light candles for those that are departed. And I know some of the Lutheran churches, actually one that my nephew led, had a celebration on All Saints' Day where they had that cadre of candles, and anybody that wanted to celebrate the life and death of a relative, of a parent, or a sibling, they could light the candle, and then there would be a little ceremony, and in some churches they would ring the bell for each name that was brought up. The concept of sainthood is much more dynamic in the Catholic faith. That is a special designation for certain people who have been considered to be extraordinary in their faith. Very often they are martyrs, but they are somebody that has given their whole life to this worship of Jesus Christ. Usually there are some miracles associated with their name, that they have been in places where if people have prayed with them, or if they've had the person pray for them, some miracle occurred in their life. And then they go through an elaborate vetting system. And they have what they call the devil's disciple, where that person tries to find the reasons to come before the board that is determining whether the person deserves sainthood or not. They come before the board and try and give all the reasons why they shouldn't be designated as a saint. In the Protestant church, more and more, it is anybody who believes in Jesus is a saint. Taking that message from Paul. Paul addressed all his churches when he was writing to them in his epistle lessons, to the Romans, the Ephesians, Philippians, and of all people, the Corinthians. And the Corinthians probably were not a group of people that appeared to be saintly at all. But Paul said they were called saints because they had committed themselves to proclaiming God and the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The other day I read a Methodist definition. A genuine saint is simply a person who makes goodness attractive, a person who has a winsome, radiant, contagious commitment to God. That's probably one of the weakest definitions I've heard. Evelyn Underhill, who is a religious writer, said we call people saints, and we should remember sainthood and emphasize sainthood because they have the ability to rescue and transform another human being. An interesting definition of sainthood. My guess is that somewhere along the way, you've heard somebody living referred to as a saint. Perhaps when they're dead, passed away, but more and more it's used for people who are still living, who demonstrate some kind of care and love and concern for their fellow men. I know, and I just heard this last week, one of the nurses that was attending, one of the people that was visiting that was sick, said those nurses are all saints. They should have a special place in the kingdom of God. Sometimes they can be somebody like an AA sponsor in a program for addiction. That person who comes to serve the people that he is the model for, comes to serve them whenever they call. He's on call night and day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The person is having trouble dealing with life, they can call this person and they come immediately. Sometimes described as saints. Sometimes teachers are described as saints. Usually, and they're able to put up with junior high students. But normally that's not recurred, and teachers generally not referred to as saints in terms of the behavior, but their toleration for people who are not very saintly. Sometimes I've heard people refer to their parents as saints. And I guess in some way I would have to refer to my parents as saints, because they really impressed upon me the importance of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And Paul calls that sainthood. Once in a while, even a minister is called a saint. But usually it is in terms of being responsible, loving, caring, being concerned, with exceedingly great patience. The other day, though, I heard another definition. It wasn't meant to be, but it's one now that I really associate with sainthood. I was with somebody 3 or 4 times during the week that was dying, and usually spent about an hour and a half there each one of the times. The husband would come in and out and ask if there was anything that he could do to help her. And on the last time I was there and visited, he went out a little teary-eyed because he knew the end was not far away. And he started showing signs that he was crying, and he walked out. And the woman looked at me and she said, "You know, Pastor, there's just a lot of Jesus in my husband." I thought it was the most beautiful tribute that I've heard ever given a spouse. You know, there's a lot of Jesus in that man. And now, I think that I can describe or define sainthood that way. Somebody that you find a lot of Jesus in. Isn't it possible that each one of you somewhere along the line, if you are a member of the church, if you are a member of God's people, can't each one of you somewhere along the way remember somebody, whether it was a parent or a teacher or a Sunday school teacher or a minister or somebody who brought you into a higher relationship with your God and make you understand that sainthood is not just a bunch of rules. Sainthood is a feeling and a devotion not only to God, but to others. And isn't it possible that each one of you somewhere along the road inspired somebody, some way, to come a little closer, to grab onto faith a little more securely, to proclaim God a little more loudly through their works and their deeds? If we talk about sainthood in terms of perfect behavior, one that is exemplary, don't worry about that because it's not accurate. I have a book, and we covered this book in our midweek Lenten services 3 years ago. It was entitled Saints Behaving Badly. And it talks about 28 saints and their lives before they really became dedicated to God. And these are not lightweights. St. Francis of Assisi, Ignatius Loyola, St. Augustine, who really framed the whole theological concepts of the Lutheran Catholic Episcopal Church. They had lives that weren't what we would call normally very saintly. But they grew, and they grew, and they came closer and brought others closer to God and to a life that was exemplary. This last week, all the stations covered the death of one man, Matthew Perry. He was one of the actors on the television program known as Friends. I had never heard of Matthew Perry talked in any terms other than his role on Friends. But one of the things that he had told people in the last days, those who were close to him, he said, "I hope I am not recognized for my role on Friends." Matthew Perry had a strong addiction problem. I think he went into treatment 160 times. And one of the things that he did was minister to those who were having the same problem, and talking very candidly about it on television, wherever he could talk. He sought fame, he got recognition, but he wanted to be remembered. He wanted to be remembered not for a role on Friends, but that he helped people and cared for people. And when they called him and needed him, he would come. He wanted to be called a saint. Didn't use those words, but that's what he wanted. And so, as we celebrate All Saints Day today, and I ask you again, you want to be a saint? I hope that you can leave here this morning answering that question in the affirmative. Amen. Sermon is hymn, Shall We Gather at the River, 423.